Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friends Show. I'm your host, Micheal Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Sara Gon. Sara, how are you doing?
Fine. I'm not sure I could get rid of my Adida assistant, but
We'll
I'll
see
come
if he
here.
comes back.
Yeah.
I'm also joined today by Mr. Micheal Morris. Micheal, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Glad I don't have a hardy dart to deal with, although that's probably the least of your worries in Johannesburg, I would imagine.
Yes, no, I'll tell you what's worrying me right now is the fact that I am in a stuffy office at the moment, sweating like an absolute pig because I just cannot get airflow into this room for some reason. So do bear with me if I suddenly start speaking strangely and wobbling about. Also, just if you are watching on the YouTube and you notice there is some large object in the foreground, that is in fact my microphone. I've been having sound problems recently, so I'm just putting the microphone closer to my face. It's not an elegant solution, but it is an effective one. But the reason I'm telling you this is because I don't want to talk about what we should be talking about today, and that is the President's State of the Nation address to Parliament last night. So it started off with a little bit less fanfare than usual because the EFF was their leadership was not allowed to be there, and so they said they were going to instead focus on their manifesto launch, which I think is happening this weekend in Moses Mabhida Stadium. Ramaphosa spent most of the time just talking, rather than about what government was going to do, about all the wonderful things it had done and about how the ANC had ruled the country so well since 1994. There were some interesting, important things he said. He said that the social relief of distress grant, which was originally introduced in order to help people during the COVID lockdowns, was going to be extended and improved and expanded. And so it's very clear that the ANC is, I think, running this as a kind of election pitch. This is sort of an offer to people saying, hey, everyone's going to basically get a basic income grant in all but name. So that was talked about. He also talked about how the National Health Insurance Bill, it's now passed. It just needs to be signed by him. And in fact, he joked and saying, "Can anyone lend me a pen? I will sign it into law right away." It's sort of interesting that he hasn't actually signed it into law entirely yet. He did talk about it being implemented in an incremental fashion, which is obvious to anyone who knows if they tried to do it in one day, the whole healthcare system would probably collapse. So I'm not surprised that he's talking about a phased-in implementation there. He also talked about there being a new climate change fund. He talked about public works programs and employment programs, putting hundreds of thousands of young people in as teaching assistants, and lots of a sort of a vision of South Africa that was very centered around how the state could improve people's lives, not so much on people's own ability to do that or on facilitating businesses and civil society to do that. He did also say that there would be improvements to the freight and logistics system in the country because they were going to partner up with private companies to do that. And we've already seen a little bit of that going ahead now with some of the rail lines getting us a private partner. This has been, unsurprisingly, the speech was quite heavily criticized by opposition parties who said that Ramaphosa was living in a wonderland and that had no connection to the realities of South Africa. Standard Bank's chief economist said that the speech kind of failed to address the fact that South Africa was not a failed state but a fragile one. And he said that despite Ramaphosa's claims that the perpetrators of state capture were being dealt with, that fundamentally there had been very little improvement in the fabric of government institutions. So, Sara, a whole bunch of stuff to talk about there. What was the most interesting aspect to you? I mean, this is clearly an election pitch, so I think on that sense it makes sense why he was talking so much about what the ANC has done rather than what it is going to do.
Well, State of the Nation suggests that it's a sort of snapshot of where we are now. And where we are now is a very bad place. So that's why you look back at all the things the ANC did achieve in the first 10 years of governance. And then you mentioned the sort of employment programs that you've got up and running, which have provided 1 million, what do they call, employment opportunities or something, or words to that effect, which is all just, they exist and they do stuff, but they're pretty much irrelevant. And then you essentially present the fact that you're taking essentially urgent emergency funding to keep people alive in the form of social grants, and adding to them to the point where I think the figure was 28 million people are somehow beneficiaries, and think that that is an achievement. It certainly is an achievement for the ANC to keep people beholden to them because they are desperate and hungry and poor. But as a measure of success, it goes into the failed state category of successes. If you talk for 2 hours, you really don't have anything to say. So he didn't really say anything that was useful. He sort of talked up that mining still had possibilities, and as Mroni Luli said this morning at the CRA, he went to the mining in Durban, and most people said, well, yeah, but not yet, maybe not, but we're not rushing. Because, of course, there are a myriad of problems in the mining industry, many of which, if not most of which, relate to the way government has implemented mining policy, the policy it's created, the corruption, the crime, and everything else. Everything runs in. So the bottom line is that we're doing badly, and 2 hours later we are doing no better. So it was an election stunt of sorts, although pretty, actually in substance, pathetic if you think about it. My biggest takeaway from it was, and big is the word, the volumes of African indigenous material that was used to dress the worthies who attended the Sona. I think there was enough fabric there, as I said, to probably provide curtaining for 500,000 RDP houses. That's the impact it had.
Yeah, the dressing of MPs is always quite funny, particularly the ANC MPs. So, Michael, I think one of the interesting things for me about this speech is how you sort of see, I think, how there was a lot of nonsense being talked about in the government's expropriation law push. So the expropriation bill is pretty close to being sort of implemented now, and EWC has been expropriation without compensation has been a big part of the government's platform. They put it in at their party congresses, they recommit to it, they try to change the constitution to make it easier to happen. And yet, when it comes time to an election speech, essentially, sort of the justification for why we need expropriation is that the people of South Africa demand it. They need it. They're crying out for land. And yet, when it comes time to actually pitch to the voters, the president's like, oh yeah, no, lots more black ownership of land, doesn't even really talk about expropriation, just kind of waffles on about it, and then gives a throwaway line. What do you make of that, and what do you make of the speech as a whole?
I also thought that was very interesting. And he departed from the text to refer to agricultural economist Wandile Sihlobo as having told him that, Mr. President, we are going to exceed the target for black ownership of farming land by 2030. And basically, this is a man whose word we must trust, and this is through redistribution up to this point. So implicitly, he seemed to be saying, he didn't seem to be saying, but the fact that he was excluding any mention of EWC, whereas in the past he dwelled considerably on it as a. I think that he invoked kind of biblical logic to speak about the primacy of this process, and the land being absolutely critical to the economic well-being of poor South Africa and so on. So very striking that he has clearly deliberately avoided speaking about it, as you say, in those very frank terms, after having dwelled considerably on it over the past 4 or 5 years. So that was interesting. One wonders whether he's paying attention to IRR polling, but not only ours. Afrobarometer's results have been very similar in demonstrating that, in fact, what most people want is nothing to do with land reform and racism and all these things, which generally dominate so much of the public conversation, but practical things, jobs, service delivery. They want crime dealt with properly. So yeah, one wonders whether, as you say, with an eye on the elections, he is actually paying a bit of attention to what people really do say they want. Just beyond that, and it's almost contrary in a sense to the absence of any mention of EWC in the speech, was the theme. I think Chris Hutting of the CRA picked it up this morning in your very good webinar with him and Mlondi. This very great emphasis on the paramountcy of state action being the likely source of solutions. And we saw that in just about every key area of the economy that is ailing or collapsing. If it's not energy, it's freight, it's corruption, and so on. Everything focused on the fact that we must rely on state action. And it seems from some of the reaction that I've seen that business is very disappointed in this, because they clearly have an understanding of what it's going to take to turn the country around at this point, and it certainly ain't going to be action from the state. So yeah, I mean, you referred, you began the show by referring to the effectiveness of your microphone as opposed to its elegance, and I think unfortunately what we see with these grand Sona events is all this kind of pretense of elegance and none of the effectiveness. And that unfortunately is a shame. Just one final thing which I think is worth mentioning, and this is a point that Chris made very effectively, is Ramaphosa saying, "I'm looking for the pen," in referring to his apparent eagerness to sign the NHI bill into law, even though in his speech he spelled out why it wouldn't be an immediate thing. That this is really, he's kind of signaling something presumably to the electorate, but as Chris put it, this is an enormously flippant and actually irresponsible kind of response to make in what is your key serious policy speech of the year. You're actually addressing a huge multi-billion rand industry, masses of specialists who've invested time and effort and all the rest of it in their practices, that patients across the country, a vast economic sector, and all you're saying is very flippantly about all the concerns that they've raised. All you're saying is, I'm looking for my pen, which, as Chris quite rightly put it, does express a less than attractive aspect of his approach to a very serious topic of governance.
No, exactly. I mean, if the medical bodies are talking about how the country is going to be left without many doctors who will flee at the implementation of this. Yet, he should be using this speech to reassure them and say, our policy is not so bad, it's really going to be helping you. But really, it's, I agree, it's just sort of flippant to say, all those concerns, go stuff yourself, where I'm signing it into law whether you like it or not. Yeah. Sara, any final thoughts on this topic before we move on?
I would be intrigued to see the Sona given by all the big businesses who've offered their services in the latter part of last year to try and help the state to repair a whole lot of things. A, what their experience has been. B, to tell us where things are. And C, is to comment on the fact that the government keeps saying, everything's going to be business as usual, which is adherence to the National Democratic Revolution. I mean, it's actually, it's a disgrace. And as Chris pointed out, the symbolism of having to do it in the city hall managed by the DA in the Western Cape, because our parliament is still razed to the ground, there's nothing more to be said.
Oh, exactly. All right, so now that we've talked about the fanciful state of the nation, let's talk about the real state of the nation. And there are some major municipal collapses ongoing in the country. The municipality around Pietermaritzburg, Msunduzi, has said that they have about 214,000 households, but that they are only able to collect refuse from about 116,000 households. And as a result of almost 100,000 households in the municipality not having their rubbish collected. There is rampant illegal dumping as kind of fly-by-night private garbage operators sort of show up, take people's garbage, and then dump it in some field somewhere or next to someone's house. It's gotten so bad that something like 12 of the 41 wards do not have any garbage collection. In fact, the municipality says, well, we just don't have the resources. Some people whose houses are being dumped next to, who were interviewed by Ground Up, said, it's dangerous. We've tried to get people to stop dumping so many times. The dump sites are also attracting snakes and rats. Many of them have given up complaining to their councillor. In fact, an NGO was even created by some people in the community who managed to get some funding from government to go and essentially pay people to pick up rubbish and turn it in for small amounts of money. 70 cents per kilogram of cardboard, R1.50 for a kilogram of plastic bottles, that kind of thing. At the same time, in Durban, not too far away, community members are complaining that emergency boreholes which have been dug are not in the right place or are not working properly. Durban has had enormous water problems over the past couple of months, and in an effort to alleviate things, quote unquote, temporarily, the city has said that in some places it is drilling boreholes to be able to provide people with water. But the only sort of while people complain that the boreholes aren't working properly, the response from the city was residents are urged not to connect their hose pipes to standpipes to fill up water tanks on their properties. So Michael, these two stories are obviously not exclusive to these municipalities. There's lots of this kind of problem all over the country, but this is, I think, really the state of where many things are. The poverty alleviation in this country basically ended in 2011 in terms of the percentage of the population that was living in poverty, and it's sort of we've gone backwards since then, and you're really beginning to see that the evidence of that negative tide now in so many municipalities across the country. What do you make of this?
And I think one kind of sense of this that one has is the very great risk of what happens as a result of the kind of speech we had at Sona yesterday, which is this idea that everything is fine, that we are making progress, that we've made great strides since 2004, the complete absence of an honest kind of self-reflection and examination of what's really happening on the ground. And so these kinds of stories don't get the attention that they need. Because there is this the kind of political assumption that everything is actually fine, that we are making progress. These are just the exceptions, the outlier examples of things that happen to break down. But these are in fact very typical of the kinds of problems right across, as you say, right across all communities in South Africa, especially the poor ones, who always get the worst of it. And I think in most cases also it's really the solutions lie in really quite elementary things. It's just people being managed properly, political management being exerted, or political pressure being exerted from the top, accountability being insisted on, people being appointed to the right jobs and being supervised properly. It's not, it isn't rocket science, as we keep saying on the show. So there isn't really an excuse for it. We're not a country that has no money at all to spend on programs and staff. We just need to do it properly, and that's what these things illustrate.
Exactly right. Sara, what do you make of these two stories? I mean, the municipalities, the big cities, really seem to be, except for Cape Town, really do seem to be under a lot of stress right now. Durban is in terrible condition. Beaches are covered with stuff. It still hasn't fully recovered from the big floods. The water system's not working. Joburg has many municipal problems. None of them is quite as serious as Durban's, but still not too great. Pretoria, I'm not really sure of the state of it at the moment. I know they've had definitely water problems in Hammanskraal and the top of that municipality, which have obviously been very bad. What do you make of this whole story?
I think what these stories show is They are the State of the Nation address. This is what has been degraded by an ANC that has not been competent, that has favoured cadre deployment, that has stolen left, right, and centre, and it all degrades to the point where there is nothing probably in any budgets to do anything, which compounds a situation of not really doing much for all the aforementioned reasons beforehand. So now nothing happens. I didn't get, I missed the detail on the yet another climate change fund, but I suppose the advice I would give to a half-decent government administration of every kind is, if you build and maintain infrastructure properly, you mitigate all of the alleged, being a bit of a skeptic that I am, but the climate change consequences, or the consequences of large weather events that cause havoc. They cause much less havoc if your infrastructure is sound and maintained. And I think it's pretty commonly agreed that much of the damage that was caused during those floods, that is yet to be repaired with boreholes too far away and etc., was a result of crumbling or non-existent infrastructure and building settlement areas on floodplains. I mean, so much of this does not require extra expenditure that may be at a premium, but it is the nature of the performance of the government writ large, and it gives. I mean, for those living in Natal, I think the possibility of having governance of any kind that involves the ANC, the EFF, and/or Mkhonto we Sizwe party suggests that we should secede from Natal in the long run. On the other hand, if you want to get anything done anywhere, it's about getting the ANC and those aligned with the nature of the ANC out of power. There's no other way of doing it. The ANC is not going to do it, can't do it, and probably won't do it for all the sort of reasons we referred. I mean, somebody referred to the term, that we're tired of being called resilient. We are beyond resilient. We are hard pressed. We are exhausted. We are skeptical. Resilience. We've long done resilience. It's time for change. The resilience is enough.
Even a cactus can't survive in the vacuum of space. Michael, do you have anything to add before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, just, Sara is absolutely right. But Sara mentioning the whole issue of climate change, if anything's impinging on our environment in South Africa, it's this terrible poverty and this complete lack of control over things that ought to be, quite easily controlled, properly managed. But as things stand, they are posing an environmental hazard to lots of people. So yeah, that's just one element of it, which just struck me as Sara was speaking.
Sorry, just to say, it's the ANC government and Ramaphosa in particular trying to play in the global big league.
Which is another part of the things he mentioned towards the end of the speech, was going on about South Africa's great successes on the world stage, which I think, not so much.
I think we might be looking at Pyrrhic victories in the not too distant future.
Indeed. Okay, let's talk about our last story today, and this is quite a different one, but an interesting one nonetheless. And that is Kenny Kunene, who is a member of the Patriotic Alliance. He is also the MMC, the member of the mayoral committee for, I think, roads and transport in the city of Johannesburg, is very upset at 3 DA councillors. He says that these councillors, who he did not name, have released his personal information online, including his cell phone number and his email address, that they put these out on social media, and that this has left him extremely vulnerable to identity theft and have placed his personal safety at risk. He says the DA councillors should face the full might of the law, as this was a serious offence, and that he was appalled by their conduct as councillors, and they should be focusing on ensuring the residents of Johannesburg receive service delivery. Now, it's pretty clear to me why they gave out his number, which is probably that, and I used to be a member of that DA caucus back in 2016. They were very fed up with complaints being directed to them about presumably something to do with the Johannesburg Roads Agency, probably potholes, traffic lights, something not being done. And being fed up and not wanting to take the blame for it, these DA councillors said, well, why don't we just give you the information of the guy who actually is in charge of this? And so they handed out his email and the cell phone number. Sara, there's a question here about, how available should public representatives be? I know, generally speaking, most people agree that they should be pretty available. Does Kenny Kunene have any sort of point here in opening a criminal case?
Let's put it this way. You don't need to be all that available if you're doing the job. The better you do and the more you do, the less availability you need to provide. So with that in mind, I would ask you to find Kenny Kunene's telephone number and email address and put them in the ticket line at the bottom of this podcast, and then have everyone who watches it forward it and make it go viral, and then let him lay charges against the however million ratepayers of Johannesburg there are that clog up his telephone and email account. Failing which, he could just change them and not let anybody know and solve the problem that way.
Michael, what do you make of this story?
Yeah. I mean, the immediate thought is a clever politician, a really clever one, would say, this is a great opportunity. Call me if you've got any problems. I'm your guy. I'm in charge. This is my department. I'm responsible. I take account. I'm prepared to be accountable for whatever I do, and that's how I roll. But so he's sending a very ironic message that he doesn't want to be a public servant. He's not to be contacted. He's, don't come and trouble me with my job. It's I don't know whose business it is if it's not the public's business. So I agree completely with Sara. I think if you in a public position like that, and it's you in charge of a portfolio that clearly has major problems. I think it's quite ironic that he says the DA council should be focusing on service delivery. It sounds as though he's the one who should be focusing on service delivery, and this is such an obvious way to do it. Be available, demonstrate a responsiveness to the public. This is exactly what, as Sara says, we're beyond resilience. We're now looking for politicians who can stand up and say, "Yeah, call me if you've got a problem. Call me. That's my job. I'll fix it. I'll do my best to fix it, and I'll phone you back and tell you what I've done." That's That's
indeed, and exactly as Sara says, it shouldn't be that an MMC should have to be called by anyone actually, for a problem, unless it's like a massive problem, like the whole sinkhole has sucked up the entire bus depot in this Joburg CBD, something like that. That you should call the MMC for transport or finance or whatever. But when the system doesn't work, it is the responsibility of the politicians to do what they can, especially when they're in the executive. And
I think I've just realized what Kenny is upset about. He's tired of people phoning to ask for an Uber Eats delivery of sushi.
Perhaps.
Oh dear.
Okay, and with that, I think we're going to call it to a close now. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and we will see you all next week with a Daily Friend show. Cheers, everyone.